We're so pleased that you've chosen to follow our AdoptED podcast. I'm Joe Sandigato, the Director of Communications and Public Relations for Mer. And at Mer, we believe the best way to help introduce the process of adoption from foster care is through education. Hence our cutesy little title of AdoptED. The theme for today's show is Mental Health Awareness Month. On our podcast today, we'll be discussing the various supports available for youth with mental health needs. We'll also have a visit later in the show from Meri Viano, the Associate Director for the Parent Professional Advocacy League, or PAL. Meri will share with us a bit about our agency's work in supporting youth and families. Without further ado, I'm excited to kick off the show with our opening segment called At the Table. Joining me at the table today is my co-host and Child Services Coordinator for our Western Mass region, Maurine Albano. Welcome, Mo.
Welcome. Thank you.
How are you?
I was hoping you'd invite me back.
Well, I mean, we're kind of an ongoing item now with co-hosting the show from time to time, right? And here we are in May. Sun's out.
Today, anyway.
Beautiful. I know it's been a rainy spring.
It's been a very rainy spring.
Rainy spring. And so we've talked an awful lot. So Diane has also co-hosted, as you know, and we are here in May, and we've had 4 prior podcasts, and we've talked an awful lot about the process. You know, we talked a lot about how do you get invested, how do you get involved, what are the resources, you know, all of those pieces. And so as we evolve this, we are moving forward in our education. And one of the things I thought was very apropos because May is Mental Health Awareness Month, but also because many of our kids have backgrounds that might include some mental health or therapeutic needs, I thought it'd be good to talk about that and to offer some resources. So, you know, really, when we talk about kids with mental health needs, it's one of the things that we talk about in MAP class. We talked about MAP in the past. That's Massachusetts Approach to Partnership in Parenting. And we look at all the various ways that a child's background can possibly play out, right? So when we talk about mental health, I really wanted to start talking about my own journey. And so one thing that I always remind everyone is your child's story is their story, right? It's not our story to tell. Right. So I just want to say, as I always do whenever I'm sharing stories about my kiddos, I'm very, very pleased and excited that my kids often will come out and share their stories. They're very invested in this work. Not everyone, but many of them have, and many of them have shared their stories and allow me to share their stories as a way to extend this work. So as I'm sharing stories today, just know it's with the permission and consent of my kiddos. But I have 7 kids that I've adopted from foster care, and we've dealt with a number of issues over the years. And so when we talk about the needs and services here in the Commonwealth, I've been directly engaged in some of these, and I started this process back in the late 90s, and the landscape for therapy and mental health services has changed an awful lot too, right?
Certainly has,
that's a big piece of it. So with that in mind, one of the examples I think that it's easiest to share, and the one that relates the most to our topic today because he has such broad needs, is my son, who came to me at 4, and he had a pretty challenging background. This is right around 2000, so we had evolved some in our understanding, but the alphabet soup was nowhere near what it is today. And I affectionately call all of the various ways in which we define mental health needs alphabet soup, because when you live in this world, it all becomes PTSD, RAD.
It's all letters.
It's all the jargon, we'll demystify that today. But back then, it was a pretty similar diagnosis to the way in which most children who have needs when they're younger begin to participate in the system. So it was ADHD. You know, he was a kid who was out of control, and as he got a little bit older, we came to understand that he also had autism, and it had previously been undiagnosed, and then there was just all kinds of other stuff. But the good news is, and the reason I tell this story is that for a kid who had so much involvement with the mental health system, who was hospitalized numerous times, who was on a variety of different medications, who went through multiple therapeutic modalities, and who just, by all accounts, was a kid who just was such a challenged kid. He is now 24.
He's 24.
He finished a culinary program. He's now in college for business management. He's living independently in the community. He does have some supports.
Yeah.
He's driving. So, I think a lot of times we don't see full life cycle, on these things. And so I'm in a position now where it's 4 to 24. I've got 20 years of viewing this. And if you ask me at various points in time during that process how I felt about it or how I felt about addressing it or what I thought the needs were that were being met, probably would have told you a lot of different stories.
I bet.
So
it changed during those 24 years.
Changed during
Probably
those 24 years.
Yeah.
His needs changed during those years. But the one thing that doesn't change, and I say this to every single parent, the investment that you make in a child will bring them far further than what they would have had if somebody didn't invest in them.
Exactly.
So regardless of what the needs are, and there are lots of needs, right? It's that investment that makes all the difference. So
got that right.
Yep. So he's doing pretty well today. And one of the things I think that, let's start at the highest level, right? Not every child has extreme needs. I've given you an example of extreme needs, but one of the things that I think that we engage with and talk about as adoptive parents is transitional or ongoing therapy. I think many kids, and perhaps from your experience too, you can think of some kiddos, but I think, it's always a topic of discussion. I mean, if we think about the process of going through foster care and, moving into adoption and transitioning families, that's a lot of change.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it certainly is. Yeah.
Leaving bio family, moving to foster family, from foster family to pre-adoptive family.
And doing this numerous times,
Some of them.
For many kids, leaving one foster home to another foster home, to
Yeah,
another
and
foster home.
Some kids.
And learning, like you said previously, before we even came on the air, but, in learning 18 sets, if you've been in 18 foster homes, you have learned and have had to accept 18 sets of rules that were set in each of those homes.
Yeah, that's a huge piece. Yeah. I think, and so the story that I shared was within context to my, to one of my adoptees. And when you've been given all of these different expectations, even for the most resilient, well-intended, rule-following child, you still have a number of different sets of rules kicking around in your head. And that may be potentially very different than the child who grows up in a household continuously with the same parents who might have a fairly consistent set of rules. Right. Even if the multiple rules were good, were well-intended, were great, they're still different.
They're different. It's a change. It's just another change that they'd have to accept and absorb.
Yeah, so it's a lot. So that transitional or ongoing therapy is important. Oftentimes, it'll be part of a conversation that you might have with your social worker, that a child may be coming from a home where they're already engaged in therapy. A lot of kids, I'm sure you see with your caseload, kids who might be engaged in therapy already because they're moving to the adoption track. Right. Yeah. So I would say that first and foremost is important for people to consider. And I have kiddos who stayed in therapy well beyond that because there were other issues that came out and other things that they needed support for. And then I have kiddos who, once they were transitioned, they were fine. Yeah. And the other thing I will say about therapy is that, like anything, people plateau. Kids plateau, adults plateau. I think back to some of my younger kids, they needed transitional therapy and then we were out of therapy. But then they get a little bit older and new stuff came up. And as new stuff came up, then we might have re-engaged, right? So it's a process that is not necessarily linear. You can jump in and out of it.
And did you as a family also participate in the therapy? So it wasn't just a one-on-one with the child and the therapist.
There are a lot of different models and perhaps a lot of different opinions on the part of parents in what they like. I'll tell you what I like is I like a model that includes the family. My model also included biological connections in some cases. So meaning that ongoing therapy, well, let me lay it out for you. The easiest way to do it is explain it.
Yeah. Okay.
So there's a couple of different models of therapy, but a really participatory model is often important. I think for any family, but especially for families who are new to being together, it's important for the therapist to understand the differences in how your family may perceive things versus how the child perceives things based upon their background. We talked about all those different homes and so this family engagement piece is important, and the way that it always played out for me was the child would meet with a therapist, but I would also, my family we would do it as a family sometimes, or it would be a parent who was there would meet with the therapist, so that the therapist got a really well-rounded perspective of what was going on. Certainly the child through their lens has a particular perspective, and as an adoptive parent, I had a particular perspective.
Right.
And the therapist was sort of like the central hub who took in all the lenses and then was able to reflect on it all. We also included, I mentioned, bio parents. In one case with some of my sibs who share a parent, we were actually able to do parent visits in a therapeutic setting.
Wonderful.
So the therapist also got to meet the biological parent, and that's another lens, and that's a lens that therapists might not often see, right? Yeah. So the better their picture of the landscape, the better they can provide resources and help to guide, the children through it. So for me, that's how it played out. Some people may have a model where the child goes in alone and, maybe they speak briefly with therapists. Some are more invested, but I always like the family therapy model. To me, that always seemed...
I think so, too. All-inclusive. So everybody has a chance to share, what their expectations are. Maybe we're setting expectations too high and too soon. Right. So everybody has their own outlet.
Yeah. So I think it's good. And so when you're doing therapy... one of the things that comes up, and especially, in other episodes, we'll get into, sort of school interventions and that kind of stuff. But the term DSM or DSM number comes up, and DSM in the therapy world refers to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And what that means is that there is a number that corresponds to different diagnoses.
I never knew that.
Yeah. And the reason it's important is when accessing services, especially school-based services, this is important for individualized education plans, IEPs, right? The needs that get met are based on a particular diagnosis, and that carries a particular code with it and so forth. How you get support is oftentimes based on how you are diagnosed. And certain diagnoses qualify you for certain things in the therapeutic support world, and certain ones, may have different kinds of support. So this is
like what? Give me an example.
Yeah. So when we talk about, we're talking really about psychological evaluations, and that's a part of many people's journey as they're working through things like IEP plans, for example, right? Or seeking treatment from community resource providers. A nice solid psychological evaluation is important because it helps to, I want to use the right terminology. I wanted to say it helps to map the brain, but that's not right. It helps to figure out how the person who's being tested interfaces with their environment. And the reason that that's important is because when you are providing services, if you have an executive function disorder, which is, think about that as like a computer and the way you file things in a computer, if you don't have a file system that works where you can put stuff into a folder and then go back and pull it out easily, that's kind of like executive function. That's making it super, super basic. But sometimes it's a matter of teaching how to file and how to retrieve files. Sometimes it's a matter of having accommodations because you can put something in a file, but then you aren't able to pull it back out, right?
Or you can't figure out what file you put it in. That's me. Okay.
What file you put that's a different conversation.
Okay, all right.
I have that too.
That's another IT problem.
That's a I don't mean to reduce it to that, but I try and always find a way to explain stuff so that it's relevant and that it makes sense, right? So
I get that.
So there's an example of something. So so executive function is a particular thing. ADHD is its own thing. We'll get into some of this, but it's really a standard classification of mental disorders used by health professionals. I did already talk about ADD and ADHD, and that's attention deficit disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I think you tend to see a lot more ADHD today, in my opinion. In the old days, I used to see a lot more ADD. But this is not just foster kiddos. I mean, this is a pretty common diagnosis for many kids today.
They tried to convince me years ago my son was ADD, had ADD.
Yeah.
But
And
then we decided he was just going to be an actor when he grew up because
Play to-
every day was different.
play to your strengths.
Yeah, that was it. That was it.
I 100% will tell you that I am not a clinician. None of this is being, neither of us are clinicians.
No,
We should have
absolutely
started at the
not.
very beginning by saying this. We're just hoping to share information that people might find helpful or relevant. But as a non-clinician, and I'm very invested in this world over the past 20 years, because in order for me to best, serve my kids, I also wanted to understand what it was, and
Sure.
that's just how I
Yeah.
am. I have ADHD for sure, 100%.
Uh-huh.
The good news is, I always tell the story about how my first two that I adopted were 4 and 9. They came as siblings, and my last two came to me at 4 and almost 9. They were almost the same age, right? The difference in having both of my 4-year-olds had ADHD, but the first one was diagnosed with ADD, and it was a big naughty thing. We didn't talk about it.
Oh yeah.
Doctors didn't want to prescribe meds. It was really very, very taboo. And we, by the way, coming out of the 90s, we were very resistant to medication therapy, very resistant. And I meet a lot of parents who felt the way that we used to express ourselves. And we used to say, there was a lot of turmoil. Let's get things settled. Let's, really kind of see where everything falls. Let's get through the honeymoon. And then the honeymoon turned into 1 year, 2 years, 3 years,
Yep,
4 years.
long honeymoons. Yep.
And the way that the medical community and therapeutic community was responding changed. So we began to understand that with caution, and everyone can certainly have their own opinion. This is my opinion. With caution, with investment and understanding, and making sure that you're making the best choices on behalf of your child, medication, I've seen amazing things happen because of medication. So I say that because when we went through it, some 15 years later, 16 years later, both 4-year-olds, ADHD was like, I had a relationship with the doctor where I was able to say, here's what I'm seeing. It's a pediatrician I had for all of my kids.
Yeah.
And so my new little guy started going. And so by age 5, about a year in, I said, we're having some problems in school. I'm seeing a lot of these, particular characteristics. We talked about it. We said, let's keep an eye on it. And then 3 months later, we were in for something, some checkup of some sort, or probably a shot or something. And so my doctor said, what do you think? We had this conversation, and I said, that I'm not big on medication. So one thing that's interesting is that although I am an advocate now for medication when it makes sense, is I personally am not big into medication, so I'm very cautious. So they have an assessment. So I used the assessment tool. We continued our conversation, and he said, you know what? Yeah, he said, I trust your judgment because we've done this with so many other kids,
Right,
but beyond that, all the markers are there. Let's try. We tried it. I kid you not. My son came home from school and said, Dad, I was able to read today. I was able to focus on my work. I was able to,
You're kidding.
So
Wow.
immediately noticeable. Staff reported the same. When you do this, there's a lot of eyes on all of this process, right? But everybody reported the same. We got the dosage right, and he is absolutely level, focused. I mean, you can tell when he first gets up in the morning before he has his medication versus
so he's
when
still on this.
He is, yeah. And probably will be for a while. I don't know if he will be forever. I've had, so some of my kiddos did some medication therapies for a short while, and some of them have some medications for life.
Yeah.
Just, when there is, one thing that I learned is when there's missing brain chemistry, when there are certain chemical processes that are lacking the chemicals to complete the processes, those are the kinds of things that I came to understand. There is no amount of love, nurture, redirection that's going to fix that. There are other things for which medication simply provides a tool to teach. So very successfully, a few of my kiddos who might have been on ADHD meds came off once they were able to slow down enough to learn how to direct their activities, and then went on to not use it for the rest of their life, but had learned the processes. So sometimes medication can help get you in a frame of mind and positioned so that you can learn the things.
But sometimes it's
sometimes
your
it's a
own
brain
self-discipline.
chemistry. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. So ADHD can be treated with medication. Kids with ADHD as a diagnosis full normal lives, full productive lives. As a matter of fact, more productive lives in some cases. If you take the example of my son, part of his deficiency was that he was very neglected when he was younger. So he was nonverbal. He hadn't, by age 4 was fairly nonverbal, didn't know how to read, really hadn't gotten those kind of basic life skills that many kids get at a pre-K level. And so while having to deal with ADHD on top of that, it was just very hard to play catch up. After that, it leveled him out and he was able to catch up, and pretty much is at grade level, by grade 3, by grade 2 probably, and into grade 3, pretty much at grade level, and focused and notices the focus. But it's ironic that we're having this conversation because just yesterday we were coming back from karate class, and so that's something new for him and he loves it. And karate is, it's a physical thing to do, which is good, right?
Right.
We always say, get your wiggles out.
Yep.
He's getting a little old for that, but he still says it.
Yeah. Yep.
But it also teaches you mindfulness. And so one of the questions he had was, do you think karate will help me like medication helps me? And I said, I absolutely think that that's the case. I think that will ultimately play into that same kind of skill set, right? And so it's interesting that he's very included in the process. He understands what it does. I've always made sure the kids, kind of understood it, but it's important and it's helpful. And, we see a big difference. So
Wonderful.
Yeah.
So they've all participated in karate?
No, not all,
No,
not all karate.
no.
Different things, sports. Oh my God. We've had football, track, soccer, basketball, baseball, karate. I mean,
Okay. All right.
Music.
I thought karate was the only activity or sport.
No, but
let's
this is
say,
his. This is he found this and likes it probably better than anything. We've tried gymnastics and we've tried all kinds of things, but karate seems to be his thing.
That's the quick. Good.
So moving on. Do you know reactive attachment disorder? From your kids' caseloads.
Yeah.
I mean, you know what it means.
Yep.
So RAD, R-A-D, means reactive attachment disorder. What do you know about it?
All I know is it's scary. When people see it, they run. And then all of a sudden, you see current updated information come in on a particular child and go, oh, this kid doesn't have RAD. It's been misdiagnosed. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know where it falls.
Yeah.
And how do you diagnose it? And what's it look like in a kid? But all I know is it's labeled as a scary
People
diagnosis.
feel scared of it. Yeah. So I think, reactive attachment disorder, even when you're dealing with it firsthand, my experience is that it's not that scary, but you need to know what it is and you need to know what to do with it. And what makes it scary is if you treat it the wrong way. So reactive attachment disorder is a rare condition that occurs when infants and children who are subject to extreme neglect or abuse fail to establish that bond. So a typical nurturing bond is, child cries, child is met by parent with bottle, child drinks bottle, child gets sleepy, right? And it's sort of and soothed, and child cries, mother or father picks up child. When an infant is neglected, they don't have that expectation. So it often happens at infancy. It can happen later, but it often happens at infancy. A child with RAD, which is diagnosed typically between 9 months and 5 years of age, rarely seeks or responds to comfort when we're stressed. So what that really means is that they also have unexplained episodes of irritability, sadness, fearfulness whenever they have contact with caregivers. Here's what it meant for me. A child who came into my home who had RAD was not a child that I was going to hug. So one thing that we decided was very important to our family was that we wanted our children to have physical bonding and physical connecting. But for a child with RAD, that doesn't do anything. So what's interesting is one of my kiddos is absolutely someone who has reactive attachment disorder who gives hugs and says, I do it for you. I know it's important and it makes you feel good, but it doesn't empathy.
Yeah.
So even for a kid who doesn't get anything out of it, and I can't imagine not getting something out of a hug because that's me. That's how I feel. That's a need.
Yeah.
That's a need that gets met for me.
Well, you're Italian, that's why.
Right. Big huggers, right?
Me too.
But the whole idea is that for a kiddo with RAD, there's no emotion attached to the thing.
Yeah.
So they're not seeking it. And in the absence of it, the things like the irritability and sadness or fearfulness that oftentimes would be soothed by those kinds of physical interventions or by someone paying attention to you has nothing to compare it to. So that's where the RAD comes in. So what I say to parents, if you're dealing with reactive attachment disorder, is just understand the kids' boundaries. And in our case, what happened was my child saw that our family behaved a particular way and wanted to emulate it, even though it wasn't important to them, because they realized it was important to somebody else. And as you said,
Empathy.
that's teaching empathy.
Mm-hmm.
It's important, right?
So how do they soothe themselves then? I mean, if physical contact
Yeah.
is not what they need, or
It's tough. They've got to find a way, and this is where therapy comes in, right?
Yeah.
This is one of those things you can work on in therapy,
okay,
because it could be anything. It really, the one thing I've learned about, therapeutic intervention is it can be anything. It can, if you have a really good therapist, art therapy can be very important. As a matter of fact, we have a whole display going on during the month of May at Boston City Hall, where we have kids from the Art Gallery who put together these wonderful art projects, and they're working through art therapy as they're helping to tell their story, and so there's all kinds of ways in which you can do it. But so RAD, don't be scared of it. Just know what it is. All of these things have a huge web presence, lots of stuff to read. You can read it in the DSM. But really, don't be afraid of it. PTSD is another one. PTSD?
oh yeah,
What do you think about that?
Disorder. Again, I see a lot of it. I know it's brought on by trauma early in life, but I guess it can look like any. I mean, there's various types of trauma that kids can be exposed to, and then have reaction.
Yeah.
So.
Do you remember where it came from? Do you remember when we first saw it? It wasn't related to kids.
Oh,
Do you remember
probably veterans, huh?
Yeah, people coming back from war.
Yeah.
And so it's a mental health condition that's triggered by a terrifying event,
Yeah.
as we can imagine war would be, but so too are some of the trauma events that children experience in their homes, either experiencing it or witnessing it. Symptoms can include flashback, nightmares, severe anxiety, as well as uncontrollable thoughts about the event. And people who go through PTSD and go through traumatic events, who are diagnosed with PTSD, who've gone through traumatic events, sometimes have temporary difficulty adjusting and coping. But the good news is, with good self-care and some time, they usually get better. If symptoms get worse, or if they last for months or years or interfere with day-to-day functioning, then that's something that really should be treated. It should be, there should be a plan in place. I have worked through this one as well. I can tell you that there can be very, very good outcomes. But care plans, the shortest care plan in my own personal experience is probably a couple of years, and there's one care plan that is probably going to be lifelong because the trauma was that big.
Yeah.
And but again, not so I don't ever want to reduce anything to my perspective or my perception. But what I do want to do is let people know that I've had a lot of time with this, and I get to see both sides. Do you remember the old Joni Mitchell song, Both Sides Now?
Yeah.
I looked at life from both sides now, right? So that song is about...
is that the name of the song?
Both Sides Now.
Was that the one with the clouds in
Yes.
the sky? Or clouds?
Clouds.
It's clouds. I always thought it was clouds.
I've looked at clouds from both sides now, right? What's interesting is that I'm at this place where I looked at it from the lens of being a prospective parent. I looked at it from the lens of going through it, and now I'm looking back at it through the lens of having gotten through it.
Right.
And so that's why I happen to be listening to Joni Mitchell this morning, but it's a good reference.
Yeah.
Her song is about, I've looked at clouds from the ground up, but I've also been in a plane and looked down at clouds and how different they are. Yeah. And I've looked at life from both sides now. I've looked at it from when I was younger and as I'm older, and I've, I think that one thing that I do like to share is that, yes, these things can be difficult, but we shouldn't be scared of them to the point where we don't want to investigate it. And PTSD is another one of those things. Great, you can have great outcomes. Anything you pay attention to, anything that you put effort into is always going to be better than something you ignore.
Exactly.
And you can have good outcomes. In this vein, this is almost like a list, and this is not a list that I developed from my own interaction with kiddos, but as I go through it, I'm realizing it's that oppositional defiant disorder. Have you bumped into that?
Oh,
ODD?
my daughter had ODD. No, I'm just making that up. But some days it was like that, especially during her teenage years.
Well,
yeah,
that's a good way to think about it. But it's different. And here's why it's different. It's a child who really displays an ongoing pattern of angry or irritable mood. And we're not talking about, we expect it in the teen years. There's lots going on in the teen years. Yeah. But, when your 6-year-old is defiant and argumentative or vindictive against people of authority, those kinds of things, that's very, very different. And the other thing to keep in mind is with ODD, that behavior often interrupts the normal daily activities. So that's within the family, at the school. It's hard to tell the difference between adjusting and ODD. This is why I always think therapists are so important. Having
Wait a minute, say
professionals,
that again.
Just
Adjusting.
The kind of kid who is being defiant because it's something new.
Okay.
And the kind of kid who truly has ODD. And the difference is the length of time and the amount of time. And with a child with ODD, you've got to do some work. Yeah. And it's just very different than redirecting. This is a very
transition
deep-seated...
can be hard for everybody, and every child at every age. So I can see where there's a difference. And transitioning is one thing.
100%. Yeah. And so some of this stuff, I don't recommend, personally, I'm not a clinician. I am not giving professional advice in that capacity, but
We've
experientially
heard that
don't believe in doing any of this real extreme testing until you're kind of involved in each other's lives for a little while. The therapy for sure, but when we start talking about psychological testing and really starting to qualify some of this stuff, you kind of have to get through the honeymoon and let the dust settle a little bit, and and it happens over time.
Got it.
How about anxiety disorder?
Oh,
that's not just our kiddos. What do you know about that?
Me?
Yeah, anything?
A whole lot. A whole lot. I think we all feel anxious. When you're doing a presentation, when, you're just everybody has social things that they're inept about. So sometimes being in a large group or social gatherings, but I think, and it's fine to be anxious. Everybody, that's expected. But I think when it's perpetual, it's something that you're living with day in and day out.
That's very different. Very different. And so if I go way, way back in my career when I worked for Cigna Healthcare, one of the things that we did was a lot of community programming and health education. And we used to do this particular program that talked about stress that motivates versus stress that hurts you. So stress that motivates is you should be a little bit nervous if you're in a new environment, if you're starting a new job, if you're standing up in front of people. That kind of stress helps to keep you on your toes. But if you feel that way in situations where average people would have a response that's less anxious, that's a problem. And that's really what we're talking about. Anxiety disorder, everyone feels anxious now and then. It's a normal emotion,
of course,
right? You don't want to be flattened out to the point where you feel nothing, because it's the yin and yang of life, right?
Yeah. Seeing anxiety sometimes is good, because it's kind of what.
If you're driving and the car in front of you jacks on their brakes, you should feel anxious at that moment. That keeps you alive. Right? That's good.
Got it.
That's good.
I like that alive part. Yeah, because if you didn't react that way, wow. Okay.
Yeah. Or when you're dealing with a problem at work, something unexpected happens and you get that, that rush of anxiety, panic. Some people might say panic, or that's important. But when this behavior, especially in this anxiety disorder group, and there's a group of mental illnesses really that cause distress and keep you from functioning normally. Yep. So panic disorder, social anxiety disorder, specific phobias or fears, that may be rational or irrational. In generalized anxiety disorders, people who have one worry or fear and they're constantly overwhelmed by it, it can be disabling.
Yeah.
So with treatment, though, people can manage these things well. It's important to remember that there may be kiddos who experience this, and that can be overcome just like anything else. So,
right.
This is a pretty big topic. I'm sure you've seen this, but depression, and I don't want to minimize it, but.
Okay, what I can't figure out is, say you have a couple sad days.
Yep.
And you really can't pinpoint it to a special thing that's happened.
Right.
But there's a few days when you feel down, blue, and you're waiting to get out of the funk.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what's the difference between that and depression? Or, and we see this in kids so often, and we don't know how serious to take
Right.
it. Is it just a mood, sadness brought on by triggered by something, or is it long term?
Is it long term? And I think that's the difference. Let's think about the life of a child in care. Okay. I think I learned a long time ago. I had this great mentor in college who always said, consider the position of the other. And that's a life skill that I've carried forward in all of my work. So that means if, politically you're a Democrat, consider the position of the Republican. If you're, a particular gender, consider the opposite gender. If you're whatever, right? So it's this idea that but also, put yourself in the position of the person you're considering. Mm-hmm. Think about that, right? So I think about
There's that word empathy again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Empathy is important. Mm-hmm. But if I put myself in the position of a child and I think about where they're coming from or where they've come from. Remember, for many families, adoption is a joyous event. It's a day to get to, and it's a wonderful thing. But what I always remind people of is that for you to have your happy moment, a child must break up with their family. Yeah. A child must would have to be unplugged and lose something in order for this process to have a gain. And that's the reality. I don't say that judgmentally. I don't, but that's the reality, right? So a loss creates a gain. So if we put ourselves into the mind of a child, and especially for depression, right? Mm-hmm. You got to think about, is it environmental? Think about a child who left their biological home, has been in a foster home for quite some time. Unfortunately, mom or dad aren't able to reunify.
Right.
Right? They've not taken the steps or been able to complete the work that would allow their family to reunify. Child has been thinking about reunification and now is thinking about adoption, and now we're in the adoption process. And while they, depending upon a variety of factors, may be further along in their mindset than other kiddos, right? You still have to think about the whole process. So if I'm that kid, I'm with mom and dad, things aren't going well. Somebody came in, somebody's come to help. Yeah. There's a family who's taking care of me while mom and or dad are getting work done so that we can all live together again. Okay, now we're not going to live together. Now, the family that I'm with, I may or may not stay with. If I don't stay with, now I have, I'm going to meet another family. I mean, I think I would have some days that aren't feeling the greatest.
Yep.
I think it would be pretty
Talk about funk,
normal,
huh? Being
right?
in a funk. Yeah.
So I bring that up only because of the point that you made. I think, especially when we're talking about kids on the adoption track, there will be some days. But what we're talking about with depression, and I'm not trying to minimize it, there is a whole body of work around depression. But really, most people feel sad or depressed at times, and it's a normal reaction to loss or life struggles. I mean, that's the way it goes. But when you have a lot of intense sadness, when you really feel hopeless and helpless and worthless, and it lasts for days and weeks, and you don't want to go out and you don't want to engage with people, and that's very different, right? But the good news is clinical depression is a treatable condition, right? So like many things, it's treatable. Right. Also in depression includes bipolar disorder. Do you know anything really about bipolar disorder?
Well, I think those are the mood swings. Like if your extreme depression could then quickly lead to
mania, right? They call it manic,
yep,
right?
Manic.
So manic depressive is how we used to call the disease.
Yeah.
Where you're funky, and then you're up,
right.
And then we all can be up, and have bad days, but it's not a big cycle that just keeps swinging,
like
and we have things in between.
And ups are a little more, not as the valleys aren't as deep.
The peaks aren't as high, the valleys aren't as deep. So, so this is bipolar is a manic depressive illness, which is a brain disorder that causes unusual shifts in mood, energy, activity levels, and the ability to carry out day-to-day tasks. So. So this is the tip of the iceberg. So today, the DSM that we talked about earlier is DSM-5. The most recent version has about 297 diagnoses in it. Mm-hmm. And we've covered just a tiny bit.
Yeah.
But later in the show, I'm going to be joined by Meri Viano from PAL, and we'll discuss those needs further. And so I guess to conclude this piece a little bit is to say, what do you think? With your almost 20 years at Meri, what are your impressions of how resilient children can be? Having talked about all of this today, what are your thoughts? What do you typically see, and what do you think the outcomes are like? I know you plug into some kids longer than others, but really, how has it played out for you in your recruitment work?
Well, I mean, the children I see most, because I focus on them most, are probably our older kids, and they all seem to have a universal desire, of course, for love and acceptance.
Right.
But, I also see in them a fear of being disloyal to birth family, or a fear of changes that they're going to have to face. And, of course, all these unknowns that's going to come with it. And, these fears, I'm just thinking of myself. And again, that's empathy. I'm trying to put myself in their place. But there's fear of losing their siblings. Members of their birth family that they've been aunts, uncles, cousins that they've been clearly associated with for years, losing their friends whenever this new change, every time there is a change, this is going to happen. Change of schools, maybe a change of their primary language is going to disappear. Their culture. Unless somebody makes a special point or is of their same culture, they're going to lose their culture, which means their traditions, the foods they eat every day, celebration of holidays. Families have traditions. All those traditions are going to be lost from birth family or from pre-foster families. So that's why I think it's so important that whether you're a foster family or an adoptive family, think of these things. Try to bring in the child's culture with them into your home. Things in their past. The clothes that they like. Don't head into the Gap and have them, all of a sudden wear this certain style that you like, and when that's not their style. That's just not who they are. Keep them who they are. They bring to you and your family into your home a whole new perspective for you.
That's true.
But it's so much who they are, and they're losing so much. At least let's let them keep their own personal identity, and hopefully part of their culture too.
I agree. And I think that also gets back to an earlier point that we made. If you can start them on the healthiest baseline possible, then all this other stuff is just going to be easier to deal with because you're not going to be adding to it, right? I mean, that's super important. And I will tell you right now, the one thing I can say is a kid who was adopted from foster care, continue with mass health coverage and have access to the care and services they need. And the other thing that I always remind parents is kids are resilient. I tell every parent what I've said probably 50 times already today, but that is that the thing you pay attention to will have a far better outcome than the thing you don't. So no matter where you start from, paying attention to something is just going to make it better. Right? So important.
Yep. True. So true.
So do you think we need a vocab lesson?
No,
today?
Absolutely not.
I think this was a vocab lesson.
Yes. I'm told my brain is saturated. So I think we're good today. Let's think about this.
Okay.
And,
all right.
You know what I do think? I think for families who are interested in adoption, they should come to an event, and go onto our website to see what's happening around the state, not just in the Boston area, but from the north of Boston, south, east, west, central. Look to see what's happening. Go to our website, which is mayerinc.org. Check out all our social media outlets like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or just give us a call.
All right.
617-964-6273.
Well, great. Thank you, Mo, for another stimulating and educating conversation. I'm glad we have an opportunity to share our information and experiences with others. It's important to know that you're not alone when you're engaging as an adoptive or foster parent, and I hope that our listeners know that we really understand what they're going through, and we hope that we can be a voice of acceptance in their lives and understanding and provide resources. But I appreciate you. Thank you for spending time with me.
Thank you. I appreciate you too.
Great. Well, we'll be right back with a few waiting children right after this short break. Be right back. And now it's time to introduce you to some of our waiting children. Today we'll learn about Damon and Carmela. It's probably a good time to remind our listeners that they can find information about either of the children at our website, marinc.org, by clicking on the Meet the Children tab and entering their registration numbers. So Mo, we have a couple of kiddos to present today. Who do you have for us first?
We got Damon, and his registration number is 4193. Damon is age 13, and he says that he has a great sense of humor.
We have a great video of Damon. I think he does have a good sense of humor.
Is it a video?
There's a video as well.
Also?
Yeah.
Okay, I get it. I haven't seen it. I'll have to go back and look at it now. But Damon is loving and affectionate. He's of African American and Lebanese descent.
Great.
He can seem shy when you first meet him, but that's me too, of course.
Well, that's a lot of us.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. But Damon thoroughly enjoys the company of others once he warms up and feels comfortable.
Okay.
Oh, how typical is that, right?
Right.
Damon's favorite activity right now is playing video games. Well,
what kids
else?
is it?
He's 13.
Right.
But he is open to trying new things, and that's what's important.
Right.
If you take nothing else out of this is what's important.
Right,
He likes to try new things. He used to play flag football.
Right.
And enjoyed that very much. He would benefit from a supportive family that could expose him to different types of activities because he likes to try new things.
Yes.
And sometimes be outside of the house. He's in the 5th grade this academic year, and his teachers report that he has a great relationship with other students. Damon is legally free to be adopted and would thrive in a home with at least one male caregiver.
Right.
He has the potential to be the most successful in a family that can provide him with structure, routine, and predictability. Any interested family should also be willing to allow Damon to have ongoing contact with his maternal grandparents, as they're extremely important to him.
And kids have those connections, and
Of course
it's
they do.
important to know. And just to remind people, when we say things with at least one male caregiver in a home with a female or no males, or these are clinical. A lot of clinical assessment goes into making these determinations, right?
Right.
I mean,
right.
you're on the other end of it where you're putting profiles in, and you've got all of the notes.
Right.
We don't say it lightly. We say it so that people have expectations that are realistic.
These are words, probably a lot of this from a therapeutic point of view.
Right. So great. Well, he has a great video.
Yeah.
I think he's playing baseball, right? I think he's with his worker.
In the video he's playing baseball?
Or playing football maybe out in the front yard. And
You mean FLAG football?
FLAG football. I think he's playing pass. I'm going to
Okay.
say pass. I'm not the one to make an assessment of that. But so great. So check out 4193. All right, who else do we have today?
Okay. So we've got Carmela. She's age 11. Her number is 6621. And she said, my dream is to become an Olympic gymnastics.
Good.
She's of African American descent, and she describes herself as funny and silly and talkative.
All right.
She is athletic, and she enjoys activities like gymnastics, basketball, and soccer. Her favorite gymnast, sorry, I apologize. I'm looking at it and going, how do you say that word? Her favorite gymnast is Gabby Douglas and Simone Biles.
Okay, we know who they are.
Yeah, I do. I can actually see their faces as I'm talking about them. And her favorite basketball player is LeBron James, and I can picture him too.
Okay, good.
Carmela loves basketball, gymnastics, videos on YouTube, and she often reads chapter books about her favorite sports.
That's good.
Yeah. In some of the other activities, she enjoys are painting and listening to music.
Typical.
Yeah. She also loves animals, especially Maltese dogs. And when she grows up, Carmela wants to become an Olympic gymnast, an actress, or a teacher, or a doctor.
Those are all
that.
Pick anyone from that list.
Yeah,
those are all fantastic goals.
From one extreme to the other,
right.
She's game for any of those careers. She is also legally freed for adoption and would thrive in a family that has previous parenting experience. It is recommended that Carmela be placed in a home with 2 parents. Again, this is probably her clinician making suggestions. Because a 2-parent home where she is the youngest or the only child, would be in her best interest.
Right. Somebody's thought a lot about that, right?
Right.
When we get to that point, somebody's thought a lot about that.
Interested families will need to be willing to maintain relationships Carmela has with members of her birth family.
Okay. But that's not, again, not unusual. And we try and make sure that all that stuff is out there up front so people have
Exactly.
reasonable
Yep.
expectations,
Yep.
right?
Yep, and remember, Carmela's number is 6621.
All right, Mo. Well, for anyone interested in learning about these kiddos, I'll remind them what the process is like. You can visit us on marink.org. Call us at 617-964-6273. Attend an event. It's always a great way to get information. So thanks for joining me, Mo. It's been educational, and of course, we always have so much fun. We're going to take a little break, and then we'll be back with our special guest, Meri Viano from PAL. Be right back.
Bye.
Welcome back to AdoptED. This is our Adopt Talk segment where we get to meet community members who are involved in the foster care and adoption process. Joining me today is Meri Viano, Associate Director of Parent Professional Advocacy League, or PAL. Parent Professional Advocacy League is a statewide grassroots family organization founded in 1991 that advocates for improved access to mental health services for children, youth, and their families. Welcome, Meri. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Good. Well, for full disclosure, I want to just tell people that you and I have known each other for probably well over a decade and a half or more. And in that time, you've had a lot of roles with PAL, including your current role as Associate Director. Tell me a little bit about your background and history with the organization.
So it was really interesting. When I first came to PAL, I was a family that was looking for resources myself and trying to find and navigate the maze for both children's mental health and I think just supports and access and information.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually was across the street from PAL for about 7 years before somebody let me know that they
were
existed.
there.
They were there, they existed, and really came to PAL because for three things. It was free. It was insurance blind, so I could get immediate support and access. And then the third thing was meeting a parent like myself that was going through the journey. And that was just an important piece of my steps and what I was doing.
But that's so important in every aspect of this work. We talk about things like adopted families together and, having somebody, whatever it is, whatever the thing is that you want more information about or connection to, having somebody who also speaks that language, super important. Right? I mean, that's where a lot of the resources come from.
It's really important. And I think the piece that often is forgotten about is that everybody has colleagues in multiple levels of fields. So the pediatricians talk to the pediatricians.
Right.
The parents need to talk to the parents.
It's important.
It's huge.
Yeah, in every aspect of the work. And so I know from my work with your agency that you have three main areas of focus, right? So advocacy, family support, and youth voice.
Correct.
Tell me a little bit about how that work happens. Let's start with advocacy.
So advocacy is really not only in our name, but it's really the family business that we have. We're a family organization, we're grassroots, and I think one of the pieces that we find in advocacy is that often people do not know what the reality is on the ground.
Right,
so they don't know what is helpful, what is sometimes harmful, what isn't working, what is working, and also to just have a very individualized approach to families.
Right.
And I think that is huge in kind of our advocacy. We go all the way from the legislative advocacy, which is very important to us in policy.
And very formal.
It is very formal, and it's also based within relationships and having one-on-one conversations on what possibly needs to shift. And we know culture doesn't shift fast within policy work.
Yeah,
so
for sure.
It is something that we have to sit down and sometimes just brainstorm and be able to collaborate together with the political group that's there and also policy holders. The second piece of advocacy we do is that really just trying to find access for services. So whether it's education, whether it's mental health support.
Sure.
I don't want to forget that many of our families have siblings. So sibling support is extremely important.
Right. Because the impact isn't just the child and not just the parents, but it's families.
Right.
Right. And people within families.
So and often it comes, education is kind of the first step, right, that has our young people. So education sometimes can come in that. And when we talk about educational advocacy, we're really looking at what does the child need to do to be successful? That at the end of the day, they're children, they're not just students. So we want to embrace the fact that it's a whole child, whole family, whole community.
So for a kiddo who may have an IEP in place for intellectual disabilities, there perhaps is a mental health or emotional piece to that as well, right?
Right.
And that's where you can help to kind of inform parents or guide the process in some way. Is that fair?
That's accurate. And I would say that one of the pieces that we do in that is we educate that ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, actually falls under health, but there's other pieces that would fall under social emotional, like anxiety, mood disorders.
Right.
We also have to look at trauma and what youth and children have gone through to be able to give them the best support. So
trauma is it's such an important and impactful piece, and it intersects with so many things.
Right.
So many things in this world, right? So I think that trauma piece is super important. Family support, another area beyond just the IEP education kind of stuff.
Correct.
You work directly with families too, right? To kind of help them
we do
navigate the system.
We're working with all families. And I say, that could be parents, it could be grandparents, aunts and uncles, foster parents, adoptive parents. However that makeup of kind of guardianship is looked at to create a parent peer-to-peer. We really believe that a parent peer-to-peer is extremely different than a youth peer-to-peer.
Yes.
So it's looking at and dealing with what they know, what they don't know, and getting them to a place. And I often say that we see it in 3 phases. We see a beginner parent, we see an advanced parent, and then we see the crisis parent. And if you're in crisis, you forget what to do on every given day, including myself. And I've been in this field you and I have gone back and forth. I mean, when you're in crisis, everything is at the beginning.
It's hard. And, I was just, Maurine, who you met on the way in, who did the opening of the show with me, and who's my coworker, she and I were speaking earlier about all of the manifestations, and I said, I'm a parent who I used Joni Mitchell's song, right? And really was talking about, I've looked at clouds from both sides now, right?
Right.
But I have been a parent who didn't have to deal with this, who lived in crisis, and who has come out the other side and now has a reflective lens looking in the other direction. And that's a very different place. If you had asked me at different points on that journey,
correct,
I would have told you very, very different things about how I was feeling. About the whole process, right?
And we see that. I think we meet families where they're at. I think the most important piece is meeting families where they're at, hearing, validating that this isn't about them. Sometimes it's the family member. I mean, I think that's extremely hard. And the piece that we also go in is a people first. We talk their language and we teach them the language of what's happening in the community. So important. Yeah. And I think that's a lot. Like we have mentors and mentees that we connect. That's kind of like that same program. If somebody was trying to contextualize what you're talking about, who's experienced our mentor-mentee program, we do the same thing. Try and match people where they're at with resources that are most appropriate to help them kind of be able to understand and speak the language, right? And that's that piece. And then youth voice. So youth voice is huge. I think one of the pieces you'll find with family organizations is, it's kind of funny because people laugh when I say that family-driven is a Google definition. You can Google it. You can find out the definition, as is youth-driven. And we really, truly believe, and we want to be able to model both with families and with the professionals in the community, that we want the youth to be in the driver's seat. And sometimes we want them in the passenger seat with us at 12 or 14 because their voice matters and their buy-in matters to really, when we talk about just even detecting what's going on, preventing what could come in the future, that it's often, I think, mind-boggling to me that in everything that we've done, we forgot sometimes about the brain. And the brain is important, and everybody has different ways that they handle that. So we want the youth to tell us what's working, what's not working, what they don't understand, what they do understand. And it's not often, and I think this is an important piece to remember, it's not about the abundance of services you have, it's the right service for the right family.
The good match. Yeah. It's finding the right match. And that changes over time. One thing, so I'm with you on all of that. I use my son Malcolm, who comes out, and I'm sure you probably met out and about in the community, who is my now 24-year-old who came to me at 4, who is PTSD, RAD, ODD, autism, just the alphabet soup goes on and on and on, was very challenging. And one thing that we always advocated for was his voice, including through those teen years when, you are a person first and you are experiencing the same thing that chronologically everyone else is experiencing, and then there are other things that go beyond that, right? When we talk about mental health, oftentimes we forget that you are a person first, right? And so teens can be all over the place, and sometimes it was okay for him to be in the driver's seat during those teen years, and sometimes he needed to sit in the passenger seat, but one thing I would never trade is, and I say this all the time, having paid attention to the specific needs gave him a far better outcome than ignoring it, first of all. Second of all, having him be in the driver's seat even sometimes meant that as an adult, he's now an independent adult living on his own, able to manage very diverse needs in a way that's pretty independent and having a really good quality of life. And I attribute that to the fact that he was sometimes in the driver's seat and sometimes in the passenger seat. And managing that is hard.
It is hard.
So hard.
And I think the piece also that you probably noticed with your son is that this is kind of an inclusive piece, right? He at times wanted you involved, and at times he didn't want you involved. And it's going through this back and forth, but we know in national data shows if families are involved, the outcome is better.
Right.
So that doesn't mean that it has to be full. Again, you're taking over the driving.
Right.
But it means that you're involved. And I think the quality of life that you're giving, just in talking about knowing you as a person, but I think what we try to really set up with families is that our young people deserve to have longstanding families. And they don't have to live with them as adults.
Right.
But the reality is that there always is going to be this connection.
But it's a lot of work. And I bring that up because so as you know, I'm also, I do work supporting families sometimes outside of my mayor role. And, and I meet families who are in the crisis point, and I think, okay, first of all, I know where you're at. And I say to them, I know where you're at. But then I also think about where my mind was at that point. You could have told me all the beautiful stories in the world. And when you're dealing with day in and day out major crisis, there's nothing that's going to make you feel better. Yeah, it might be good to have a good role model. So I think you're back to your original point, matching people at the stage that they're at with people who can be helpful because I can tell you good outcome stories. And I hope that when people pay attention, they have good outcomes. And I know plenty of families who have good outcomes because they paid attention, whose children are in far better positions than they would have been had attention not been paid to these things. Mm-hmm. But you don't want to hear, while your kid's in major crisis, you don't want to hear, oh, you know what, 10 years from now, things will be great.
Right. It
doesn't help.
It doesn't.
Doesn't help.
It doesn't. And I think that we also have to be really realistic of what families are going through. I mean, PAL supports many families, and we often get the question, do you support families? Because again, we're free and we're insurance blind.
Right.
And that's huge. But we get parents at multiple levels. So we have very highly educated parents that have graduated with college degrees, doctorates, and they are struggling to figure out how to get help.
Right.
And then we do have families that may be at a different level of income or different pieces that are there that are struggling, but it's complicated for everyone.
Everybody.
And I think mental health in itself, there's the stigma and there's the acceptance and not acceptance of what it is.
Right.
And I think one of the things that we really need to pull back in is understand, again, that people are people and let's be human first.
Sure.
And I think that one message of kind of getting out there is that parents are going to go through ups and downs. As young people go through ups and downs, everybody does. But how to bounce back.
But you can match families and you can match youth, right?
Yep.
So you can make sure that they have that kind of support. And in that vein, you offer a number of trainings, right?
We
so
do.
Tell me more about what that looks like. For example, like I know you have a very vibrant training schedule because I'm part of your distribution.
Sure.
But what does it look like? What kind of trainings do you offer? Are there standards throughout the year?
Sure. So one of the things I would just mention is that as a family organization, and I've mentioned this a few times, all of our trainings are free for families and youth.
That's great.
So we do not charge. So whether we're talking about the educational plans and we're talking about mental health and the IEP, which is the individualized education plan, it's free for families. You're able to walk in and young adults and be able to make that connection. So some of our parent trainings are mentioned that one. LGBTQ, really thinking about kind of what does that mean and how do we support as a family. Again, going to just kind of the connection.
Lots of specialty.
Lot of specialty.
Kind of work,
What's interesting, Joe, about that too is our youth that identify as LGBTQ are trainers.
Okay.
So we're really looking at
that's fantastic.
It's a win-win situation. Not only are you being trained, but you have people there that have lived it and can tell you what works, doesn't work, and what they see kind of in the community as well, which is huge. Then we get to a level where we actually train the police and first responders. So we do a training called the Police Pocket Guide, and we will give a guide that was made by families and professionals in the community. We're on our 4th version of that.
I know. I can't believe that. I mean, but that's been huge because it's another area that was just lacking when you talk about community resource providers and really emergency,
it's huge.
Services providers. It was just a huge gap. It
goes back to your crisis piece and mentioning too, when your child was in crisis or different pieces, or my children were. The reality of the emergency respondents having the knowledge of what it looks like, but also where do you give a parent a direction?
And I can tell you, depending upon who I called upon for support and who happened to be available and able to support us on any given day meant that we had varying interactions. Right. Some were fantastic and some were absolutely deplorable. And so I think the more we can do to educate people on this topic, it's so important. So I'm on your mailing list. I get to see all of your programming that you do. And so how can our listeners get added to the list?
So if you go, sure. So if you go on our website, ppal.net, you can get right in. What's really interesting about that is that we offer something right on the front page. You can sign up for our email list. We do an email blast that goes out once a month. I often say it's not a listserv, so people are not right. With information. So you immediately go there. There's also a support group, a statewide support group list that you can get, again, free for families and professionals. Also, it's in our name, Parent Professional. We want to offer the support. Yes, we're parents with lived experience and we're professionals, but we also want to offer this kind of tailored approach to both parents and professionals. And the last thing I would mention that really is on our website, which is important, is that we do blogs. So I often write, and my executive director, Lisa Lambert, will write blogs. And it talks about the lived experience, but the piece that we offer is the youth do blogs. So if you've got a young person as a parent, and I mean, Joe, you and I both know that for our kids, when my kid was maybe stuck, sometimes having a peer that was like them,
or just somebody who they could look at and say, I'm not alone.
Right.
Because that's a tough piece of it sometimes, right? The isolation that we sometimes feel as parents, we have to remember the kids sometimes feel that too. And you brought up an important point that I probably should have opened with, but PAL is statewide.
Statewide.
You support families everywhere. You have offices.
And I laugh because sometimes because Massachusetts is such a progressive state, we get calls monthly from other states saying, what is going on in our state? How do we connect? What do we do? So we are in the community. We've got family support specialists in the community. So we hire people and give preference to people with lived experience and that have the ability to collaborate with professionals. We believe in collaboration. We believe in partnership for the best outcome of families and youth. But the big piece that we really believe in is if we're going to have something that happens possibly in Boston, we want somebody that lives in Boston to understand.
To make sure that you have the support there. But you have people out all over in the community. I mean, you know, Allie Weissman from MSPCC, and it's we were together recently at a conference and talking about the family resource liaisons, which people may be familiar with. Allie has been a guest here before. It's that same concept that you employ. They call, they check in with you, and then you match somebody from their community with similar strengths, right? I mean, it's kind of that idea that you find people to support people in their communities. And
I think the piece that PAL offers too, that's just this unique piece, and I think we see it in the state and in the field a little bit, but sometimes it's hard to find, is there's the parent-to-parent match, right? So going back to this parent peer-to-peer, the other piece is that we are advocates. So it's not a bad word, so let's figure it out, but I think sometimes we really get to the professionals or to families where they need the skills to learn. So we will ally with them to get them to advocacy, and that's okay. So to be able to walk kind of together in that path.
No, that's great.
Exactly what you're saying.
That's amazing. So really, if I think learning about the organization and learning that it exists, I'm always impressed when people stand up and say, I don't know something. I feel like that, whether it's Mayor or it's PAL or it's any number of agencies that you and I both know people from very well, that everybody knows about this. And I don't think that that's necessarily the case. I think that a lot of people know and a lot of people share. So I think it's great to understand who you are and what you do and where people can access you. So it's statewide. You can get information on the website. You can get signed up for information about future trainings and so forth. But I'd like to talk a little bit about the nitty gritty, right? Today's topic, I went into, Maurine and I earlier went into just some high level overviews of the kinds of therapeutic and mental health kinds of issues that one might face when adopting from foster care, right? So things like, we educated them a little bit about transitional therapy versus ongoing therapy, and we talked about the DSM and why that's important, and ADHD and RAD and PTSD and oppositional defiance disorder, anxiety, depression, so forth and so on. But from your perspective in working with families, let's talk about the kinds of common issues. What are the most common issues that you support as an agency? Not that it would be limited to these, but what do you really see as being the top needs that get presented?
So some of the top needs that we're seeing is definitely access issues. So trying to know, again, going back to this piece, Joe, that you said, can't believe people don't know. And when you're navigating a new maze,
Oh my gosh,
it is so difficult between the alphabet soup and not understanding what it means.
Right.
Also, what is going to be available and not available to you. Access is a huge piece.
Sure.
Side by side with that is insurance issues. We often see that if you don't have this insurance or
Right.
this carve out or this opportunity, you aren't going to be able to access the supports. And we really talk about preventative, right? We
Yeah,
want to
yeah.
prevent and be able to teach and to support so that there's not this level of possible significant mental health that's coming.
Right.
And we can only do as much as we can do, but it's important with that preventative piece to be able to have the availability. And
Sure.
within certain insurances, you're not going to have. The next piece really...
Can I stop
sure.
you there for a minute?
Sure.
Can I do a follow-up on insurance? So I know for many, many years, so I'm a MAP trainer. Were you ever a MAP trainer?
I was.
You was? Okay,
Yes.
I thought you were. I thought I
Yep.
remember that. So I did it for years and years. And one of the things we always told people was that children in foster care and children who were adopted carry mass health, and that it was sort of this gold standard for access. And I know in many cases it was in my life and for my children. But, I'm thinking about it in the context of what happened over the past year or two, where we've had carve-outs and mass health has gotten, sent out to a number of additional insurance companies who oversee pieces of the benefits.
Mm-hmm.
So is that still the same story? Should I tell that story differently in light of all the changes that have been made within the mass health that the children use to access services, or is it still that same?
So I think that is extremely important. I'm glad you brought that up, Joe, because one of the pieces that we have to remember is that national kind of movement is to pull the medical field and the behavioral health field together. So
Right.
behavioral integration is going to happen whether people are ready for it or not. But in Massachusetts, because we have had Senator Kennedy and many of the families that have politically pushed that insurance should be given to all children and all families.
Yes,
People
yes.
should be insured. We are kind of a few steps ahead,
Okay.
but in that it becomes very complicated. What I would love to remind families and remind people that are listening to this is they have a choice of their insurance carve out. They have a choice to get case manager if they're not getting certain coverage.
Okay.
Doesn't matter if it's private insurance or if it's Medicaid.
Sure.
But right now what we're dealing with the Affordable Care Act is that there's a lot of changes. So just for my child, he had 5 different carve outs within a year, but he's 20 years old. That's impossible for him
It's
to navigate by
impossible,
himself.
right.
And even for me, as what I think is a specialized professional, it takes a lot of care coordination and follow-up phone calls.
Yes.
So parents have to understand that the access issue also, if you have certain insurances, you're going to be able to get certain services and not others. So going back
Gotcha.
to what you and Maureen talked about, in like doesn't matter if it's medications, it doesn't matter if it's testing and evaluations.
Sure.
Sometimes the insurances, because not everybody can afford what it takes
Right,
with
right.
multiple children.
No, for sure.
In the needs. So I think the insurance piece is really key in knowing that you have a right to ask and you have a right to be able to be a part of what you choose
Okay.
as a person. And we are in, PAL is in ongoing conversations with the behavioral health sector
Sure,
within
sure.
Massachusetts to say what's working, what's not working, and to kind of have the pulse of what's happening. But we are a step ahead in many ways than other states, but we're catching some mistakes.
Gotcha.
And for me, I think with anything that comes, we noticed this with the Children's Behavioral Health Initiative, which was a Medicaid piece that came.
Right.
Sometimes you've got to figure out what doesn't work right so that it works better for families.
Right.
So the more families can reach out to PAL if they're having challenges, we are here. We want to walk you through.
So if somebody has an adopted kiddo on mass health that was carved out to the Fallon wraparound,
Correct.
or they've got you guys
up the
understand that you can help navigate. You can, and I'm hearing advocate for that caseworker, right?
Right.
Make sure that there's somebody case managing things,
Right.
That's a big piece.
And every insurance, I think this goes back to the alphabet soup. Every insurance calls it something different.
Something different, has a different name.
so-
but you guys have your finger on
Right.
the pulse of
We
that.
do.
You can help people
And,
figure that out.
Go to our website, call our phones, either in Boston or Worcester. We try to live by giving calls back to families within 48 to 72 hours. We sometimes are human.
Sure.
We want you to email info@pal.net, and that's another way. So we really have ways that people can get in
Lots
touch
of ways that people can do that. Okay.
to make that next step.
I took you kind of off your track. Do you remember your track? We were talking about insurance, and we were moving down the road of, talking about the nitty gritty and the most common issues. So
Yeah, and the
what
last one
else?
that I would just mention is that education is a huge piece.
Oh my God, so big.
We have to, and I welcome the opportunity that possibly, and people hearing this podcast too, that I think that your agency, our agency, many agencies and professionals also want to have conversations with educators to be able to figure it out, because though mental health is here, that doesn't mean that there's been the initiatives within the public schools.
Right.
So what can we do to make it easier for both the teachers, the professionals within the education system, but also partner with families, because great communication leads to family
community
engagement.
resources in general. I would include schools, emergency service providers, even partner agencies. I've always been a big believer in building bridges between agencies. I mean, part of the overarching work that we've had is I led the Worcester West Area Advisory Board for a number of years. You're on Hyde Park?
Boston Hyde Park.
Yeah, Boston Hyde Park. Right. Building these bridges, where I can see sometimes where, people might compete for funding or might have the same intentions. Organizations like yours and mine, we're not competing with anybody, and there's no reason we can't have these bridges. So my hope is that today, learning more about what you do, that we're bringing these resources to people and using our, collaborative lists of distribution and, just finding new ways to meet people and get people information. I think that's such an important piece. And
it's key. And I would, one of the pieces I just want to add, Joe, I think the pieces that we also bring in is if a child that's homeless, if it's a child that has been incarcerated, if there has been pieces within the juvenile justice system that have been really challenging, we want to hear from those families, because we're in it for the long haul, that no family should be left alone.
Right.
So if we're not the right agency, and I know that you guys do this within Meri as well, if you're not the right agency, you want to get that family to another
figure out where you need to be,
where to go.
Yeah,
like we're really, and sure. I think that, and the other piece that I would mention is one piece that's really close and dear to our heart, besides the juvenile justice and some of the homelessness transition age youth that we're talked about, is the LGBTQ community, because
so important.
That is something that we're really working again to be able to support, because if you feel accepted and you feel heard, it doesn't matter where that connection is, but really for that community and others, then your outcome is better.
But there's so much intersectionality there. I sit with Mass Commission on LGBTQ youth, and there's a whole homelessness task force. And, while on the surface that's about youth homelessness, there's also a plug into DPH, into DCF, so Department of Public Health, Department of Children and Families. I'm trying to use less acronyms, right, and explain everything. There's also the piece that overarches to mental health, and there's the piece that overarches to insurance barriers, and there's in any population there's so much intersectionality, and I think that's so important. Well, I can't believe that our time is coming to a close, but what else would you like for people to know about your work? What have we missed? What did I forget to ask you?
I think the piece that I am just thinking about as we were talking is that I really look at PAL as a network. You come in, you get to know PAL, we help you with a few pieces, maybe you go away for a few years, and then you're going to come back because something's just not right and you need another ear. Maybe there's a crisis, maybe there was an onset of a mental illness or mental health. And I think that the network doesn't go away. So I often look at it as we're a tree. We talk about the village and the community, but that's something that we're there and we're able to support. And the other piece is that we really want the systems to know what families are going through. So if you're having...
Take that voice and carry it forward.
And because again, sometimes it's just the way that communication happens and you need to be restarted.
Right.
So, think about it as a network. We don't need a call every day for the next 6 years. But the reality is keep us as long as you need us and know that we're in your back pocket.
And plug back in as you need to. Well, thank you for joining me, Meri. I'm sure that many of our listeners appreciate your time, as do I, and your perspective on mental health support. If folks want information about your organization, they can find you on the web at ppal.net or call your office at 617-542-7860.
Correct. And I would also add the Worcester office, 508-767-9725. That's where our main family support comes out for the whole state.
Great. And if our listeners want more information about any of our topics today, including how to become an adoptive parent, please visit us at merinc.org or call 617-964-6273. If anyone has show ideas, topics, or feedback, please email me at joes@merinc.org. And don't forget to look for our show next month, where we'll discuss more adoption-related topics and meet new and interesting guests. This has been Joe Sandagato from Meri. Thanks for joining us.